Nigel Farage appeals to some, very polarising to others, was about minus 35 with YouGov. That's dropped to minus 42.
Welcome to the polling station. On Drive, every Thursday at this time, we look at the latest polling and discuss whether the issues of the day might have an impact on politics, on voting intention, on the direction, I suppose, of the government as well, fundamentally at this point. We're joined by Executive Director of More in Common, Luke Tryl. Hello, Luke.
Good evening.
Very good to see you. So, of course, lots of conversation about the riots this week and the government's handling of it. But let's start, shall we, with where people in this country actually stand on support for the protests, which have evolved into riots.
Yeah, so obviously the big debate this week, aside from, what to do about the riots and how to stop them, is, how much of the country do they represent? How well do they reflect how people are thinking? And some people have suggested, they're channeling the views of a silent majority. Others have said, this is a handful of mindless thugs. And when you look at the polling, so YouGov had polling out earlier this week, and what's really clear is those supporting violence, it is a very small number. Those supporting the unrest, the riots, it's around 7% of the population. Around 12% say that it's justified. 8% say that they have sympathy with the rioters. So we're talking under 1 in 10 kind of across the board there. Slightly more people saying they have sympathy with the protests. It's around a third saying they support the protests, and slightly more, nearly 42% saying that the protests are justified. But when it comes to the riots and unrest, when you look across the population as a whole, it's quite clear condemnation and, a real desire to disassociate themselves. And we've done focus groups this week with Reform voters, with Labour voters, with Liberal Democrat voters. And it's always the same. The first word that they use when they talk about the riots is they say they're disgusted.
Really? That is fascinating. And so what does this do, I suppose, to some of those key characters that have been in the mix of this week? And there is polling on Nigel Farage at this point.
There is. Obviously, Nigel Farage has, I think it's fair to say, had quite a controversial role. Yeah. He has obviously condemned the violence, but has said, I think, repeatedly now that this is about, there is unease amongst the general populace, which is being channeled by these rioters, and linked it to talking points on migration. So, and it's kind of a story of two halves here. So what is definitely true is that Reform UK voters themselves are more likely to say that they have sympathy with the protests. It's still not close to a majority. It's about 1 in 5, but you compare that to sort of 7-8% of the population as a whole. So we know Reform voters are a little bit more sympathetic. But what's interesting is when you look at Nigel Farage's overall approval ratings, it was already underwater. You could remember, Nigel Farage appeals to some, very polarising to others, was about minus 35 with YouGov. That's dropped to minus 42. Okay. So a 7-point drop. And the interesting thing is one of the biggest drops has been with people who voted Conservative in 2024. And I think for Nigel Farage, the problem there is, as he looks to grow Reform from a sort of 14% of the vote party to a sort of 20, 25%, his eyes are going to be on, remaining Conservative voters, and that pool, who should be his target, are the most likely to say, do you know what, actually, because of this, we think he's got it wrong, and I'm now more disapproving of him as a result. So, not only, might you take issue with what he said in kind of, principle terms, in political terms, I don't think Nigel Farage has helped himself over the past week.
That's really fascinating. What can we analyse about, I suppose, the bigger picture behind the protest, i.e. the kind of issues that have been brought up, that have been perhaps kind of bubbling and surfaced by these protests and riots? Immigration, division in the country, trust in the police, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I actually think, for most of the public, they keep the two conversations quite separate. Yeah. Because what we know is, a clear majority of the country think that immigration levels are too high at the moment. It's between sort of 55%, 60% in our latest polling, say numbers need to come down. When you ask about illegal immigration specifically, it's around 80% say they are worried about numbers of people who come to the UK illegally. So there is big worry there. But then you contrast that with the sort of 7-8% who are saying the riots are justified. And I actually think what's ended up happening is those who've sort of said, well, the 8% are channeling the views of the 80% in some cases, are doing the 80% a grave disservice, because they're a much bigger group who have no truck for violence. It's also interesting looking at the police as well. So, in general, if you look at the polling this week, people are tending to have a higher opinion of the police than they do of politicians and their responses. People tend to have higher trust in the police. But interestingly, and YouGov has done a comparison here, even there, trust in the police with these riots is lower than it was compared to the London riots in 2011.
Right.
And that's part of quite a consistent pattern that we find in our polling, is that trust in the police has definitely fallen over the past decade. You know, the combination of, and you can see the dips, things like Sarah Everard and what happened there, allegations that, of racism in the police force. So a series of issues have undermined confidence in the police and policing. So even they're not immune from what we're seeing and this kind of wider discontent.
There is a kind of fascinating thing to think about here in the short term and the long term. So polling snapshots right now, that's really helpful. It's instructive. It gives us a sense of how people are feeling. And I wonder what the politics of that is when people are looking at Sir Keir Starmer. We were quoting on this programme in the last couple of days, this YouGov polling, 49% think Starmer's handling the riots badly. Can we safely say, Luke, that this is the end of the honeymoon for the Labour government, if indeed there was one to begin with, and actually this is a real test and people are holding it up as a test of Keir Starmer and the government?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two things there. So firstly, Keir Starmer coming in, it did look like he was getting a bit of a honeymoon in some of the equivalent. In our polling, he went up to +10, having been underwater for most of his time as leader of the opposition. That's now dipped back down to about even. Ipsos had some polling on his approval out this week, which put him at +7, which in some ways is good. It's a bounce, but actually it's lower than lots of other opposition leaders who've come in, certainly lower than Blair, Cameron, May when she took over from Cameron. It is a lower figure. And I think part of that is there is just more of a general disillusionment in politics at the moment. And the electorate's a bit more volatile. They're just willing to, give politicians a bit less slack. But the other thing to remember, of course, is Keir Starmer was elected with 34% of the vote. So we shouldn't necessarily expect that he's going to suddenly have won over a significant number of the public. So I think all of that comes together. But to the second point, how does that relate to these riots? Well, I think absolutely, because, this is the first big test of this government. This is going to be the first time that people are seeing him in action. You saw that first YouGov poll, which, as you say, was 49 to 31. What's interesting, though, is that is actually very similar to what people said about Cameron during the London riots. And I actually think it more reflects the fact that the public just don't like disorder. They don't like those scenes. They don't like what they're seeing. Again, when we've spoken to people in focus groups, they've said they want to stop watching TV. That's what I think is being reflected there. I think the more interesting question now is, where do his numbers go in the weeks and months ahead? Does the fact that people are being brought to justice lead to a boost for him? We know the public favour quite lengthy prison sentences for those who are involved. They want to see them punished. Does that help? And, if the riots and, touch wood, they are brought under control, does that then help? Is he seen to have done well here? But there is no doubt that for him, this is a real test. And not just for him, like for the whole government, right? Yeah. This is an early impression, and we know that those early impressions are hard to shake.
That's because this could be a legacy thing, and I mean that just for the next few months, by way of tackling crime and justice and the courts and prisons. This could be something of a catalyst for a government to show action on these things.
Absolutely. And you've got to remember that one of the big, points of frustration or disillusionment that was coming up during the election was this sense of politics doesn't fix anything. Yeah. The whole of Britain feels broken. The last government, particularly towards the end, I think lots of people felt a bit listless. And I think, as you say, this is an opportunity for Keir Starmer to show actually government can do some good. It can make a difference. And particularly on these issues, because as you would expect, if you look at issue tracking, it's been cost of living in NHS that have dominated for the past, 2 years or so. This week, crime and immigration soaring up there. Okay. They're going to be the issues people are judging them on.
Really, really fascinating. And it feeds into that. Can a government deal with the short-term crisis and get some credit for it, but does it build into any sense of they can fix the long-term underpinning issues of society? We've got a couple of minutes left, Luke, and we've been reporting on US politics as well this week. And Kamala Harris announcing Tim Walz as her running mate. Just run us through how the polls are looking in what is, well, we like talking about the vice presidential running mate pick pick, don't we? How much of an up or a down is Tim Walz proving to be?
It seems like he is a positive pick. I mean, the truth is, if you look at the evidence on vice presidential candidates, they don't make that much of a difference. But what is undoubtedly true is Kamala Harris is still in the midst of that polling boomlet since she she took over. I wouldn't, I don't want to overstate it. And you asked me, the U.S. presidential race, it remains a coin toss at the moment. But some polls coming out, her up 3, her up 6, her up 1, making some ground in some of the swing states. She's got that vice presidential pick. She's clearly gone for someone who can appeal to so-called middle America with Tim Walz. And what is certainly the case, and we'll obviously get more polling on Tim Walz over the next few days, is that his opposite number, J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential candidate, is polling very negatively. At the moment, he's clearly one of the most unpopular picks, and she will be wanting to amp up that contrast as we move into the Democrat convention, which should give them another boost. So my view is, you look at the polling, you look at swing states, you look at that pick, we've moved from a kind of lean Trump to a total toss-up